met him back in USC. I remember coming in the session, and I saw all the M50s in the Deca tree, and then I see you for the first time in the mixing board, and I could approach you and have a conversation with you, and you would. If I had questions, or if back then I was totally lost, I was starting, and I would have a conversation with you, and you would share, and that's great. I always say Bobby is a really nice guy, he's very sweet, and he shares, and he will teach. When you are there working with him, he will stop the session and he'll explain why he's doing it.
Well, I've always been one of those people that you always hear about engineers saying they don't want to talk, they don't want to share their secrets. You know what? There aren't any secrets. It's what we do. And I tell a lot of students that come up to me, and ask about what I do and how I do it. And I said, I can show you everything I do. And it's the same thing that my mentor said to me. I can show you everything that I do, but one thing I can't give you is my ears.
Totally.
We all hear differently. So you can take everything that I teach you or tell you. You can apply it, but will it sound like something I did? Probably not.
Totally.
And you get 10 people to mix the same piece or record the same piece, but it's going to be different.
Totally.
Will some be better, some be worse? No, in my opinion, they'll just be different.
Exactly. Yeah, I've got so many questions about what frequency do I have to cut for the strings, and what type of reverb. And it's like, no, it's use your ears. I can give you some guides.
Yeah, exactly.
And I always recommend the students, if they've got budget, hire a mixing engineer because of their ears and the training, and because you can do everything. You can compose and orchestrate and do the parts and do the mixing. You've got to leverage.
Well, that's one thing that I always stress to young composers is that surround yourself with a team.
Exactly.
You get yourself a mixer, get yourself a music editor, get yourself an orchestrator, get people that you can trust, that you're not always thinking in the back of your mind, what are they doing? Can I, do I have to worry about? No, you want to be free to deal with the writing, dealing with the producer and the director, and being able to focus on what's happening on the stage. You don't want to be worrying about everybody else on your team. At that point, it's useless, because what you're doing is going to suffer. So surround yourself with people that are competent and instill confidence in you.
Exactly.
That's a good example. Is I've been working with Clint Eastwood for years, and he's a great guy to work with. And I admire Clint because he's loyal to people. If you do your job, he surrounds himself with people that are competent, that he's confident in, and allows them to work.
Totally.
So people, you need to surround yourself with people that you feel comfortable with, that people that are interested in the same things you are, as far as you have the common goal. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm gonna throw a couple of more mixing type of questions.
Absolutely.
I've got a question from Elena. She's from Australia. She's a Berkeley student. If the mixing process changes considerably in scores that combine orchestra with prevalent electronic elements, she was mentioning the Cliff Martinez score for the company you keep. So the mixing, does it change when you are, if it's like all orchestral, or if you also have electronic?
Oh yeah, it does change. When you're working with just orchestra, that tends to go a little faster, because you're only dealing with orchestra, unless you have, you've recorded everything separately. Even then it tends to blend, it goes faster, because you're only dealing with orchestra. If you recorded the orchestra in a room at the same time, even easier, because you're treating it as basically, it's a classical recording is what it is.
Yeah.
And so you treat it that way. And for me, it goes very fast, because I tend to be very choosy about the microphones I use, and I don't use a lot of EQ. I let the microphones do that. So yeah, it's much faster now when you're dealing with synth or prelay stuff or MIDI stuff. That adds a whole different dimension, and you have to approach what is the MIDI stuff? Is the MIDI stuff considered to be individual elements to be treated as effects, or is it MIDI information that's supposed to be treated as part of the orchestra? Now, if it is part of the orchestra, do you want to blend the strings in with the live strings, or do you want to keep them separate? I tend to go by this. This is the general rule I use. If there are elements that go together to make a sound, I tend to marry those together. so that it can't be shifted or changed around the dub stage, because that's the first thing that's going to happen. Is you send off, say you have your live strings and your MIDI strings. The balance that you're hearing in this room is going to shift if you give them control. So blend them together. Same if you have 3 or 4 different elements that, whether they be MIDI or live, mix them together. So that doesn't hurt. I mean, unless it's something like to backtrack, if it's something that's to be treated separately. A good example is a horror movie, where you have this kind of different sort of elements. And a good example would be working with Chris Young, where he has all these separate elements that are
go with the picture.
That go with the picture, absolutely. And a mixing side, yeah, that brings up another point too, is that when you're mixing elements like that in a film, what you want to do is, in a film, everything has a visual connection.
So you can bring them up.
You have to do that. So it's more of an effective thing when you're doing that. Now, when you mix the soundtrack, pull that back in, because if you're sitting, it makes no sense at that point.
Takes out of the mix.
It should still be up, but not at the level that's in the film, because in the film it's there to scare you. Now, if you're sitting there just to get your attention. Now, if you're sitting in a listening room listening to it, you don't want to just like, what was that? You know. And so I tend to do that, bring it back. So yeah, there's elements as far as they do shift. Mixing straight orchestral, mixing orchestra and MIDI, and then mixing all MIDI. There are 3 different ways to approach a mix.
And when we are talking about blending orchestra and MIDI, and we've got, for example, like cello staccatos, but also we are helping with some MIDI cello staccatos.
Yeah.
Blending together means throwing them through the same reverb, same EQs, same panning for sure.
Right.
Balancing is very important. I guess.
Right. The reason you want to keep the reverbs the same is you want them to be in the same room. Once you start changing that, you sort of move things around and they're not in the same room anymore, unless that's by design, you know, which happens, yeah. But again, that is a conversation you'll have with the composer. Like, they may want something separate as that to stand out more, or to be a different color or texture in the palette.
And so, for example, when it comes more as of a pulsing low type of synth,
right?
Do we wanna? So we kept the energy and the momentum with that synth. Do we wanna keep it within the orchestra? Do we wanna compress? Do we wanna keep it separate?
Are you talking about a synth element, right?
Yeah, like a synth element.
That's
like
separate. That goes on a separate stem. Yeah. That's a separate stem. Yeah, that's one thing that I try to elements like that. Or synth effects stuff that gets put on a separate stem, and if it's a very rapid piece, then I won't run that through a subwoofer, because that's going to get muddy. But it goes on its own separate stem
for the dub session.
For the dub session, right?
And when it comes to the stereo mix down,
it all gets folded in. It gets folded in there. It's all in there.
For the synth. That one will have another reverb.
Oh yes, it'll have a different reverb on it. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that kind of stuff will not have the same reverb that the orchestra has on it. That one, depending upon what I just may have something that's more of an ambience on it. Like, I might put a plate on it, something like that. That's maybe only like 1.2 seconds or something like that. So it gives it a little bit of a sheen to it, so it doesn't sound very dry. Now, that being said, sometimes I will leave it dry if it's meant to be that way, so it's more present. And that's a good mixing tip, is that when you're mixing, anything with reverb on it will be further back in the mix. The more reverb, further back it goes. The less reverb, the closer it comes. And that's how you establish space in a mix. Width and depth in a mix is that by the amount of reverb that you put on something, and the type of reverb, whether it's a long reverb or a short plate, or stuff
I
like
get
that.
So many questions about reverbs, and
let's answer them if we can.
Usually what I tell them is, well, you can have more reverb and longer reverb when it comes to like longer string, long notes, and higher range. When you've got lower stuff, and especially staccatos and ostinatos, you don't want that much reverb. And so for percussion, unless it's just one hit where you want like a long tape, maybe a lot of reverb there. But usually you don't want them too wet, too far away.
No, because what that does, it tends to lose the impact. It softens the impact of what you're going for. Now, those elements are kept separately, but as far as like the length of the reverbs, that stuff would obviously be a shorter reverb. But you mentioned like hitting a bass drum or whatever it is that has a long tail. That, yeah, I like that effect. I do that quite often too, because I do like that feeling of it rolling and spreading across, you know.
Totally.
I like that.
A long, wide reverb.
Exactly, yeah, I do that.
If you record, because the thing is, when you get to record just, when you're recording an orchestra,
Yeah.
in a room is one thing.
Right.
Most of the composers, when they are starting with samples. And samples, in a way, is like if recording separate families in an orchestra, having like the horns and then the rest of the brass, then the high string, low strings, and so they've got the ability of applying different reverbs to different stems in a way, or different groups of tracks.
Yeah.
Would it be a good idea for them to have maybe a longer reverb if they've got a stem with long high strings, and a shorter reverb with maybe less amount of reverb if it's like ostinato, low cellos and double basses? For like creating separation in the mix.
Right. If they're all supposed to be in the same room, all blended together, there's two things. You can do that approach. You can have for all the legato strings, so that you can have the longer reverb and a shorter reverb for that, or you can take that long reverb and just use a little bit on the shorter, the mercato and staccatos. You can use just a little bit of that. That way, it still gives it the impression that they're still in the same room. Yeah. Once you start separating them out, you lose sort of the sense that they were in the same room together.
Because the track that we just listened, that sounded awesome. You could feel that they were playing that in Abbey Road, and you could feel that's everyone playing in the same room.
All the big drums, all the percussion stuff was overdubbed. But
the rest.
But in that there was some small hand percussion stuff that was in the orchestra. When you get to the big stuff, that was all overdubbed. At the end of the sessions, we put everything up. We went through each cue and picked what we wanted to do. But it's all mic'd as if it was sitting in the same room. So what I did was I placed them where I wanted them in the room. They were not just like, okay, all get together and I'll pan you over here. No. I said, because what happens is I was using the Decatree and the wide mics.
Yes.
Those give you an image of where things are. So what I did was I set up, like I mentioned before, which is one huge taiko set up on the left, one huge taiko set up on the right, and then in the middle we had other percussion. So that went across the whole pan spectrum there, and the big taikos were on the left and right, but they were also sent into a sub, which actually comes up in the center channel, or appears to be in the center channel. That is your LFE.
Yeah.
So it gives you a sense that they're in the room together.
Yeah.
Now at that point, I used a little bit of the original reverb that I used on the orchestra, so they do sound like they were recorded at the same time, and they're all part of the same, as you heard on the mixer.
Is that maybe a technique that they can use, because so often these days they'll have different libraries. They'll have Spitfire for the strings, and they'll have cine samples for percussion, and they record cine samples recorded in the Sony scoring stage. Spitfire is Air Studios.
Sure.
So should they, like, once they are done with, like, maybe they've done mixing, applying like a reverb on top of the whole thing, very subtle.
Very subtle.
You don't need to use that much reverb, because Spitfire got recorded in our studios. Nice room.
Yeah,
you don't
absolutely.
Need
yeah.
else. And the other one is in the Sony scoring stage. Why would you need a reverb? Maybe if you've got some percussion that sounds very dry, you may wanna, or if you're using a library like a scoring string that sounds very dry, you may wanna add a little bit of reverb so it blends with the rest of the
exactly.
strings or brass.
Yeah, you do want it to blend. The last thing you want is for elements to stick out as if they weren't part of that mix, or they weren't put in that room. And obviously, being MIDI, they weren't. But you want to give the illusion that they were. Yeah.
One of the problems that they face most of the times is for the mid-low end to sound muddy. And it makes sense, because when you are recording in a room, you have a set of mics, and you record it once. You've got all the orchestra. But when you are composing, you've got that set of mics, and then they'll record the higher strings, or the violins 1, violin 2. It's like overtake, and then at the end of the day, they've got like 30 or 50 tracks, and the mid-low end starts getting muddy.
Yes.
But what's your advice? What's your take on that?
What I do is I use filters a lot. Now we're only speaking of MIDI stuff at this point, right?
At this point, yeah.
Okay. As you start adding more and more tracks, and as it starts to sound muddy, find out what's causing the muddiness. and then you can go in and if you're using parametric equalizers, you can go ahead and sort of sweep and find that muddy frequency. And of course, the formula for that is, if you guys don't already know, is that you turn the gain all the way up, and then you kind of sweep the frequency. And when you hit that annoying frequency, it's going to stick out. And then at that point, then you back off the gain. Well, you leave the gain up. What you do is then you back off the amount of cut or boost on that. So say you've got it turned all the way up. When you want to cut it back, till that goes away. And now you're selectively cutting out the annoying frequencies, and you can adjust that by the cue as to how much. Exactly. Say if you just want to cut it, and so the bell is now inverted, and be careful as to how much you cut out, because it could affect the sound. And make it into something that you don't want.
And we always want to keep it subtle, right? When we are
very subtle,
cutting like 1 to 3 dBs.
Right, because that's it's going to add up with everything. It's going to add up. And the same with compression on the reverse side of that. Compression, I never really go above 3 dB compression. And if you want to really get into limiting, a compressor will become a limiter at 10 to 1. Yeah. So you really cramp. So, but just 2 to 3 dB, and that's enough.
Something subtle.
You can, if it's still too loud, then pull the fader back a little bit. But and then you can always EQ a little more punch into it that way, or a little snap into it, like say at 2400 hertz, you just put a little point on something, or maybe 250 to put a little more punch on the low mids. But yeah, just the best thing to do is use your ears as a guide, and as you're stacking your MIDI tracks, listen to where it starts to get muddy. At that point, then you need to address the issue. If you're going to start using the same type or same frequency ranges over and over again, it's going to get really bad. So then you need to start cutting that out. So a little bit each time you do it. Don't just kind of like get drastic, because it's going to sound totally different. It's going to sound terrible.
Just a tiny bit in every track, and that'll make a difference.
Exactly.
Right. Maybe not it doesn't have to make a difference in that track, but right. You put them all together, right?
Right. Yeah. Now on orchestral live recording,
that's another thing.
Another thing, what I do there is I go through, I start before one note is ever played. I set up my console so that I add filters in. So knowing what the score is and knowing how the room is going to respond, I start filtering out stuff like, say, you have violins. Well, there's nothing really usable below 75. So you can cut them out at 50 to 75, just cut them out. Same with just think of what the instrument is, like a flute. Is there anything that you're going to hear in the flute, unless it's a bass flute? Yeah. But on the average, or an oboe. So sort of just got to trim those frequencies out, just cut them. And so I do that a lot. So that way, what happens is you have all these microphones up, and it's going to add up.
Exactly.
So just start trimming it. If you find that it sounds a little toothed, then just put it back.
And that happens with libraries as well, because the recording, they were with those
right, yeah.
like M50s that come with a little bit of noise in the low end.
Yeah.
You don't hear that, but when you start stacking MIDI tracks, you start hearing that.
Right, yeah. So it's better just to go through and just start EQing or filtering it out. Yeah. And sometimes what I'll do is, if I'm recording, I won't commit that to the actual recording. I'll do it in the monitor. So what I'm listening to is not being, the EQ and the filtering is not being recorded. It's only in the monitor. So I've not committed myself to that.
Exactly.
So when I sit down to mix, then I can put that stuff back in and selectively start doing, unless it's one of these things where I have to mix live. And okay, well, this stuff is, once that cue is done, it's out of here.
Yeah.
So then I approach that mix as if it's a final mix. That means my reverbs, my EQs, my compressions, whatever it is, it's all printed, and that's what goes out. Yeah, because there's no remix happening. So.
Yeah, those are great advice. The first thing that a composer usually is able to do is have a synth score with samples.
Right.
And then bringing some musicians in, like a cello maybe, or a cello and the woodwind. What would be the advice in terms of, I guess, reverb for blending those really dry sounding instruments that they usually will record in their room, or for them to blend with the orchestral samples that sound like in a bigger room?
One thing, the biggest mistake I hear a lot is guys that go in there and they think that adding a lot of reverb and a long reverb makes things sound big. No, it makes it sound cheap, and that sounds awful. So first of all, think of the recording, think of the environment that you want to give the impression the instruments are in. Is it a really huge room and you only have like a few instruments? It's going to sound silly with a lot of reverb on it. It'll sound just like a bad movie, you know, like a cheap score. Totally. No, just add enough to give it some ambience. And unless it's a horror movie where it has to be kind of effecty. But as a general rule, just blend in stuff like good thing, like a small hall. Try that. So it's maybe 1.8, 1.9 up to 2 seconds of reverb. Try that.
So, so you're saying using an algorithmic digital reverb on that, would it be also a good idea maybe throwing that instrument through a convolution reverb to sort of simulate?
Yeah, exactly. Well, you saw what I have here. I have the Disney Hall up here, and that was just designed for the tails. You know, and that's because I don't want it to sound like it just dropped off a cliff. So, yeah. Pick a convolution reverb that you like, whether it's a Disney Hall, whether it's whatever. You know, Concertgebouw is one of my favorites in alt reverb. I use that. But where do you want the orchestra to be, or the whatever, the chamber, whatever it is, a quintet, quartet, whatever. Where do you want them to be, and then pursue that. Yeah. Never make it sound like they're in the Grand Canyon or someplace like that when they don't have to be. And that's, like I said, again, that's the biggest mistake. Over-reverbing everything, because that's like, if it's got a lot of reverb, it's going to sound like it's in a big room. Well, it's going to sound terrible.
Yes, totally. When you are mixing, I've got a question from Vincent. He's from Canada. When you are mixing, are you thinking about the effects, the sound effects that will come later when you are mixing? Because you also you've done that as well.
Yeah.
You know how that goes.
Yeah. Vincent, what I always ask for when I mix is obviously the picture, but I always ask for the dialogue track and any effects tracks that are available, because I always mix to those three things. First of all, picture, because that's not a radio show. You want the dialogue because you want to make sure you don't get in the way, and you want effects to see what you're up against, see how big the effects are and how big you have to make the music sound. So those things, I'll always mix with dialogue and sound effects and our picture. But yeah, always have those on hand, because not having dialogue and effects could get you into one of those remix phone calls, because you're in the way of dialogue. And remember, and that's what I tell all the students, no matter how good you think your mix is, dialogue is king. It always is and always will be.
It's like vocals in a record.
Absolutely, it's exactly right. That's exactly what it is. The dialogue is the lead vocal, but you need to hear it.
Exactly.
Yeah,
totally.
Yeah.
There's a question from David, Italy. He asking if both with samples and orchestra, when we are working with samples, when we are composing, we have to draw a lot of automation for creating all the dynamics and cross-fading between the different dynamic layers. That's something that we do when we are composing. And the orchestra, they do a great job there. But when you are mixing, do you add extra automation for bringing?
I certainly do. I do. And I just call it just making you breathe a little more. If you have stuff that obviously it's kind of been done by the orchestra, but sometimes you want to exaggerate it. So I will ride the mix, and I'll have them grandmaster so it goes up, so you can feel like there's some sort of breathing. So it doesn't just sit there. There's some emotion.
Something much subtle than riding a vocal, right?
Exactly, absolutely. Very, very subtle.
Very subtle.
And another thing too is if you're working in a DAW, and what I do is I set up my glide times to what the tempo of the music is. Like if it's very slow legato stuff, then I will have it set up so if I make a move and I let the fader go, it's going to come back very slow, very subtle, so you don't hear it. As opposed to a pop tune, let it go, it's going to come back. Yeah, so I tend to use a longer glide time when I'm working on very orchestral pieces, so it comes back and you don't really hear that. Sure. Yeah, that's the last thing. It'll be very evident that you'll hear this sudden drop. You don't want that. You want it to hear as if the orchestra is just coming back.
I recommend I suggest them to mix, they compose in one project, even Cubase or with Logic, and then when they are done, I tell them export those tracks. Or if you if you don't want to have all the track, export stems like high strings, low strings, right. And then all the writing applies differently to different stems in a way. Is that a good idea? Like having when the strings come in, having a little bit of a expression there, and then for the horns they go down, and then
Yeah.
So it works great with every section in the orchestra.
Right. Yeah. You're just creating automation. You're creating a move. That's all you're doing.
Some magic happening there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you never want anything just sit there, because sometimes I found this too. Sometimes if the orchestra plays it and they're not really giving any dynamics, it'll just kind of sit there. So you want to create a mood. Yeah. So it has to match what's happening on the screen. And I'll do that. That's why I mentioned having dialogue earlier, because if I'm sitting here and I'm mixing, I'm listening to dialogue, and I realize maybe the orchestra got a little too loud there. I can shape that so it comes down like that, and you don't notice it. All you notice is that there's a slight decrescendo. It comes back, and then it comes back up again, and you don't notice it. All you notice is that there's room.
It just works.
You hear the dialogue, yeah.
Even with percussion, right? If we need some power here, but then...
Yes, exactly. And that's what mixing is all about. You have to make it fit and stay out of the way. Yeah.
And that brings me to the last question, I guess, which is, there are so many plugins, right? And the students usually get into, I need to have all those plugins because they do so many great things. But the thing is, mixing, let me know if I'm wrong, but mixing is about levels most of the time, about a good panning, a good balance, good reverbs, a little, some good EQ, very subtle compression, and then specific things like specific effects, but it's not about, I'm going to compress this a lot and I'm going to add a lot of reverb because it's going to sound big.
Those are all the wrong things to do. I don't use a lot of plugins. I do, if I'm doing, say, a rhythm stuff, things like, but orchestral stuff, no, not a whole lot. I use plugins for effects. I use them for emulating a console, like the Neve console here. Then I have the ML4000, which is my basically limiter. So those are things that I use all the time. But do I just grab a plugin and just go and want to do it? I have to admit, sometimes I do. If I'm working on something and I want to try something crazy, I'll get a plugin. Yeah, an effect. Yeah. But and I did go through that, guys. I wanted to have every plugin I could.
It doesn't. It's just.
And I found that I wasn't using all of them. I just like to sit there and I go, I just wasted $400 on something I'm not going to use. So no, but what you need to do is selectively go through and decide what you really want to do with the plugins that you have, or learn to use them first, and see if that works for you. If you want to try something different, demo it before you buy it, because you may get it and you go, I don't really care for this. So save yourself the $150 or $200. Demo it. Every plugin manufacturer has a 14-day demo. Try it, and that's what I do. Then I find that I like it, I'll buy it. And then I have to think about how many times am I going to use it. If I'm only going to use it for one time,
rent it.
Rent it. I'll demo it for the film, and that's it. I'll demo it for 14 days, and then I know that I'm not going to use it again. But say the composer had asked me for that. Can you put this effect on that? Sure. Do you have it? No, but I will. By the time we sit down to mix, I'll have it. Then and hopefully the mix won't go longer than 14 days. So,
Bobby, what advice would you give to a composer who's starting and has no idea about mixing and has to start?
Of course.
Because they'll face those
problems.
What would be like the main things that they have to focus on? Because they'll see so many plugins. What would you say? Maybe don't use the plugin, start with...
Well, it depends on what they're going to write. If you're talking straight orchestral?
Orchestral music.
I would just think of them maybe getting good EQ plugin and good reverbs, whether it's a convolution reverb. I gravitate more toward the hardware reverbs because I love the TC6000 reverb, which is my go-to reverb. I use the 960. Occasionally when I'm doing like some poppy vocal stuff, I'll go to break out the 480 and I'll use that. But then I go to the plug-in reverb. I love Altiverb, and I like the UA stuff. I like the EMT stuff and the 250. I use that a lot. I like those reverbs. But I always my orchestral stuff. I always gravitate toward the hardware reverbs. I just love that sound. When those aren't available, then I will go to the Altiverb stuff. I'll use that for the orchestral stuff, which would be whatever it's Concertgebouw or Disney, whatever fits what I'm doing. I guess the saying is I'll use a plug-in till it doesn't work for me anymore. Then I'll try something else. But I mean, I'm pretty well. I mean, been doing this for so long that I have a set group of plugins that my go-to plugins, I should say, which would be my compressors or my EQs, things like that, and reverbs. Yeah. Because there are times when I know that I'm going to be mixing and I'm not going to have access to any hardware stuff, like all the stuff here, the Pultecs and the the LA2As, and I'm not going to have access to the real hardware stuff. So I will find that in a plugin version and use that.
So I've got so many students that they've got all those plugins, right? And they are all about, I've got this new plugin and it sounds great. But when it comes to mixing, what's more important? Is it using all the newest plugins, or where's the difference? I say to them, use your ear.
Right, yeah. But don't use a plugin just because you have it. Because what will happen is you'll become so bogged down thinking about plugins, you'll lose the focus on what the mix really is. Now, if you're doing a really poppy, effecty song, then yeah, plugins are fine. But the main thing is the mix. And again, I can't stress this enough. Don't use a plugin just because you have it. It could be the wrong thing. Just think of what the mix needs and then go from there. Concentrate on what the mix is. I mean, these are the best things you have, your ears. And that's...
So when you say mix, is having a purpose, what this mix needs.
Right,
and
exactly.
When it's mix is levels, right?
Right.
Panning.
Levels, panning, reverb, and EQ, and clarity of the mix. And yeah. You want to create, for me, my ideal mix, and it's not always the case when I'm working in a pop tune, because that's basically a wall of sound. But for me, on the orchestral stuff that I do, the perfect mix is, I want to be able to listen to it and feel that I can step right into it, because I want to have space in the mix. And that gets back to what I said earlier, is about the reverb effect. So anything with less reverb is going to be closer to you. Anything with more reverb is going to be further back. Now, when you're working in an orchestral environment and you have the decatry up, that's already established by the distance of each instrument to the actual recording point, which is the decatry. So in order to maintain that, you can use your reverbs, and if you want something, so you're adding something that wasn't part of that, where do you want it to be in the orchestra? If you want it to be closer up front, then you have less reverb on it. If you want it to be farther back in the mix, then you add more reverb on it. So you push it further back in the mix. And also where you want it to be when you're panning it,
exactly.
That's based. So
and keep things natural, the way they are.
You want it to be natural, yeah. Unless, again, the other side of that coin is if it has to be very effecty, then you can break out every plugin you own and have at it. I'm guilty of it once in a while, but
everyone.
But yeah, but I don't let the plugins dictate what I'm doing. I mean, I concentrate on what the mix is, and a lot of the times it sounds kind of silly or cliche, is that the music will kind of direct you what it wants to be, or what it wants to be, especially in a big orchestral score. But
that I would say it's one of the biggest advice. Actually, I've been here a couple of times, and I've seen you, and I've seen that several times, chopping the tracks and moving, aligning, making sure that the levels are right. And once you've done that, it's 80% of the sound.
Yeah.
Then you know a couple of plugins there for reverb. And, that's it.
Yeah, plugins. Yeah, plugins for me are kind of a thing. Especially if an equalizer is basically there to sort of solve problems. Again, back to what I said earlier on in the interview, was that if there's a problem, say something is a little muddy, well, adding high end is not going to fix that. It's only going to add high end to a muddy track. Find out where that mud is, and then kind of EQ it out slightly, just by the amount of cut, and then the width of the bell. And that will clean up the track a lot.
Exactly. Well, that's great advice, Bobby. At least for me, anyway.
I hope this helps everybody else out there.
Yeah. So there you go, Bobby Fernandez. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Pleasure.
And,
great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for watching.